think they're going to put up just a single cover slide, so you won't be following a PowerPoint this morning. That'll give you time to attend to your Facebook and Twitter accounts. Listen, but type. So in any event, what I'm going to speak to this morning is engaging public in the NEPA process, kind of a specialized area of community and public outreach that a lot of us that operate on public lands have to deal with. In this context, community isn't so much the folks in the towns and the burbs as much as it is the environmental community, the stakeholders that have interest in the resources. In this particular case that I'll be talking about, Tavaput's essentially uninhabited, literally tens of miles from the nearest full-time resident, quasi-wilderness. So in any event, the folks that have interest aren't necessarily live anywhere near this. As a matter of fact, we had folks coming to some of the meetings that I'll be talking about from Washington, D.C. and the East and West Coast. So first, what are we talking about? The project proposal. I'm going to try to make this more about process than outcomes or specifics, but it was an EIS for 800 wells, around 600 well pads. 1.3 TCF of gas is what we thought we would be developing ultimately. Southern portion of the Uinta Basin, just west of the Green River at the edge of the Desolation Canyon National Recreation Area. About 80% of the lands were public lands, federal lands, and I think the next 15% plus or minus were state lands, settler lands, and then finally just a trace of private lands in the area. So as you can see, dominated by public lands, and we're going to be in the middle of the National Environmental Policy Act processes for an EIS, an Environmental Impact Statement. Resources that we had to deal with, deer and elk critical habitat, sage grouse, bighorn sheep, Mexican spotted owl. We had wild and scenic river that ran through the project area, National Recreation Area, abutting it, backcountry byway, BLM Visual Resource Management 2 areas, area critical environmental concern, and those were the easy ones. In addition to that, had abundant archaeological resources, rock art, pit houses, granaries, rock fort structures that within and adjacent to the project area, and that still is the easy one. The hard one was wilderness. Some of the most productive areas that we had anticipated development were within wilderness study areas, wilderness character areas that BLM had designated, and were part of the Citizen Wilderness Proposal, Red Rock Wilderness, for those of you familiar with Utah, and had been advocated for wilderness designation for the better part of 20 years. Probably didn't need to tell a joke earlier. Sympathy lapse probably due at this point with the ability to get this done. In addition, history of litigation. We had, in the earlier, prior to the EIS, we had been through several project stages, seismic shoots, pipelines, interim drilling activity, some exploratory drilling. Each phase was met with litigation. We had largely prevailed through that, or had essentially entirely prevailed through that litigation over the period of, for I guess 5 or 6 years. And our combatants were not insignificant folks. It was Sierra Club, NRDC, National Trust for Historic Preservation, SUA, Wilderness Society, 9 Mile Coalition, Utah Rock Art Association. So it goes on and on. Tisha, don't worry. This isn't just business as usual. What a way to gauge the public in the courtroom. But don't ask for your money back. There is a second half to the story. We had a change of administration, and that provided time, motivation, and opportunity to take a different tact. Time, whenever there's a change in administration, things slow down at the end of the last, and nothing happens at the beginning of the first until people can get familiar with all of the things that they're being asked to authorize and consider for authorization. We recognized that, and we proceeded with what's described as a programmatic agreement under the National Historic Preservation Act. It's a very structured process to deal with cultural resource issues, and that brought 10 of the the archaeological stakeholders to the table, as well as members of the balance of the environmental community, and that's going to bring me to opportunity. I call it forced proximity. So we had monthly and bi-monthly meetings, a minimum of half-day meetings with a lot of the folks that I had described earlier that had been in opposition to our project up until that point in time. So we asked ourselves internally, is there anything? Imagine Bill Bear Corporation working on an EIS for 4 years, going into a change of administration, facing another year of slowdown, and coming out of the backside of that year of slowdown with a certainty of litigation that would suspend the project for years, perhaps in addition to the 4 years that we had spent in the slowdown period. So we asked ourselves the simple question, is there anything that we might do to avoid litigation here? And we posed the same question to our combatants, folks that were participating in the programmatic agreement process, and remarkably, the answer was, let us think about that. And that really started the outreach process that we ultimately engaged in. We identified 3 communities, the wildlife community, archaeological community, and wilderness community, and spent a lot of time working with those groups. Remember that we had gone through 4 years of an EIS process, had developed alternatives. BLM had adopted a preferred alternative. They hadn't yet authorized it, but none of those met the community's concept of what was responsible development. So we engaged those groups, literally hundreds of meetings with those 3 communities, and crafted yet another alternative on top of the 4 that BLM was already considering in the EIS process. We engaged sincerely, incredibly important. Took literally, I would say, half to 2/3 of the time that we spent was gaining trust, understanding each other's positions, and finally, maybe a short period of time, then ultimately working out the compromise that ultimately formed our final alternative within the EIS. And we also had to make sure there was other stakeholders. In this case, we had the community. They were very supportive of our development. We couldn't alienate them because they're very pro-oil and gas folks. So in contrast to some of the discussions we've had earlier, our community was pushing us further to the right continually. Both the state and the county governments were less excited about the compromises that we were reaching than the environmental community was. And ultimately, we had to make sure that what we were proposing fit within the range of alternatives that BLM had previously analyzed. That's kind of their decision space. And we couldn't get outside of that unless we wanted to rewind the clock for another 4 years. And to the bragging on the environmental community, they recognized the need to stay within that decision space and not cause us to rewind the clock. They wanted to see some certainty. They liked the outcomes that we were pursuing. Again, this is less about outcomes than it is process, but we agreed to avoid development within the WSA, the Wilderness Study Area. These were previous existing leases. We plugged and abandoned some old wells that were within the WSA to kind of clean up some of the disturbance that had occurred previously within those lands. Greater employment of directional drilling than what we had earlier. Green River Rafters can see part of this, so we agreed to low-profile equipment, offsetting our timing so that we weren't there. So those kinds of things, dealing with each of the communities, wildlife, archaeology, and wilderness. So finally, this was a real sort of leap of faith. Are we going to enter into this process? And we had to hope that these folks wouldn't ultimately litigate or protest the decision. It's a very broad community. We had maybe brought 15 to 20 groups in total to the table for the discussion, but there are hundreds and special interest. And the environmental community over time assured us that they thought they could kind of wrangle the outliers into the fold, and believe it or not, it worked. No appeals, no protests, and we were moving forward with development within 30 days of the authorization of our project. The benefits, obviously, the alignment that having everybody from the Secretary of Interior down through the Director of the BLM, the state office, and the local office buying in, and the environmental community brings certainty. We've been getting APDs in 35 to 45 days for this project. We'll drill on the order of, I believe, 100 wells in Tavaputs this year in this very difficult environment that I described earlier. Lessons learned from this process, and this is what's really exportable, and I hope that folks will take to heart. And that is, NEPA isn't a communication process. We've relied for a long time on kind of the public scoping process that's contained in NEPA, and kind of the spoken hub with BLM at the center of the hub of communication. So everything you have to say to the stakeholders ultimately goes through BLM and then out. Everything they have to say comes back through the hub of BLM and back to you, and that isn't a very efficient way to communicate, and quite honestly can be distortive at times of what your thoughts and intentions really are. Kind of interesting, as those of us in this business have a general sense of government needs to get out of the way and let us get about our business. But in the case of NEPA, we seem to be willing to let them control the dialogue. And that's what this process was really about, is the direct outreach, engagement of that community, involving them to develop ultimately the project proposal that BLM analyzed and authorized. And quite honestly, it's something that we'll be employing on essentially every NEPA project to one extent or another. NEPA, the way it currently works, is broken, and there is a better way to engage the community. Tisha asked us to address what we thought we might do differently. No genius here. Obviously, you can tell that we were slow learners on the challenges that we had in front of us, but I would say start early, and we wish we had started sooner. Thank you.